right? So our series is Community Matters. And remember that our goal in the series is to look at what it means to be a community church in the 21st century. And as we talked about it when we got started, that fundamentally what it means is what it always meant. Serving the community where God has placed you. That I am absolutely certain that there is no accident to the fact that this church is located on this piece of ground, in this town, in this exact moment in time, and all the time before it. And through that, God calls us to be a force of his light in this area. And that's always been the role of a community church. But the details of what that looks like change. And we talked about that in the very first week, that some things that have to change are just a difference in the way people worship. Just there are people who like to worship with different styles now. That traditional worship is still important to so many people. But for other folks, a much more modern, kind of upbeat music, less structure, is also important. So what we want to do as a community church is meet both those needs. So that's the part that's new. But then last week, we looked at what is possibly the oldest aspect of what it means to be a community church, which is that we recognize that in everything we do, we are God's representatives. We are the representatives of this church. And so when we go out, the way we treat people matters. That it certainly reflects on us, it reflects on God, but also it's a chance to make a difference in lives. That's what we see when we interact with people in a positive way. Well, this week I want to take another look at something that's never really changed, but the details might be different. So I've titled this week's message, Into the Fire. Because if you look at the history of Christians, the over 2,000-year history that we have, something that Christians have consistently done, particularly in the earliest centuries of Christianity, was care for people. That Christians developed this reputation of looking at situations when disasters would rise, when plagues would come through, when everyone else was running away, the Christians were running in. And the Christians were caring for people. And even when the task was hard, even when the outcome was uncertain, with no certainty that what they were doing was going to make any difference at all, the Christians consistently went in to help. And in fact, in those earliest years, it was really a distinguishing factor of Christians that they were willing to help people. And not just their own people. That's what made them so strange. The Christians would help people who didn't believe what they believed. The Christians would help people who actually opposed them when these issues came up. And what ended up happening was that this little minority religion of Jesus followers that came to be known as Christians, this little minority of Christians began to grow. And this minority started to have influence beyond their size. They were making changes and improving lives beyond the number of people that they actually had. And what's kind of interesting is that the Christians, particularly in the early centuries, were doing so much good, it was actually upsetting the people that opposed them. Because the leadership, particularly in the Roman Empire, didn't like the Christians, but there was this problem. The Christians were doing so much good, they kept getting more and more popular. And that was true in the first century, in the second century, in the third century. There's this huge opposition by the Roman emperors to try to stop Christianity. But Christianity was growing anyway because of the influence the people were having by doing so much good. And then in the 4th century, something unimaginable happened. Early in the 4th century, an emperor named Constantine comes into power. And Constantine was different than the earlier emperors. Constantine believed in religious freedom. Now, not just for Christians, but for everyone. He felt that people should be allowed to worship as they feel appropriate. And by doing that, the Christians could start to come out of hiding and could start to impact more and more lives. And in fact, Constantine himself actually became a Christian prior to his death. But like so many other people, Constantine one day dies. And the emperors that follow him don't necessarily feel the same way. And about 25 years later, an emperor comes into power named Julian. And Julian doesn't like Christians. But he had a problem. They were doing so much good, he couldn't get rid of them. That their popularity was growing so much because of all the good they were doing, he couldn't get rid of them. And it actually frustrated him tremendously because these Christians kept helping the people who opposed them. And it was making him look bad. In fact, we actually have an excerpt of a letter that he wrote. Now, this isn't from the Bible, this is from the historical record. And this is a piece of a letter that Julian wrote. He says, the Christians, in addition to their own, support our non-Christian people. It's shameful that our poor should be wanting our aid. In other words, these Christians took the command by Jesus to love everyone very seriously. And they were helping all these other people. And they were doing good, not just for their own people, but for everyone around them. And it was making it much harder to get rid of them because they kept growing. And so what Julian is kind of screaming here is that, I want to shut this thing down. But how can I shut this thing down when they're doing so much good? And then it occurred to me. Would someone say that about the Christians now? As we've inherited all the work and all that has happened in previous generations, would people say, man, those Christians are doing so much good. I wish there were more of them around here. Living here is so much better because there are Christians located right here. And it's making everything better. And do people say things like, wow, the Christians do so much good. Maybe I should become a Christian. Because that is the legacy that we have inherited. That was the legacy of Christianity. And I believe those things are still alive. But we want to really light a fire under ourselves. Because that was the distinguishing factor again. That these Christians, when they were so focused on caring for others, that they would get out there and they would make it a point to do good. They would run into the fire as everyone else was running out. They would look at what was needed, and they would go to where it was needed. And they were willing to do what others were not. Now, this really kind of builds on what we talked about last week. Remember that last week, we talked about the Apostle Paul, a guy named Philemon, and a guy named Onesimus. And what we saw in last week's message was that the Apostle Paul's, the way he lived his life, influenced people so much because he treated people so well, that he was so people-focused that it had incredible impact on the lives of Philemon and Onesimus, and they in turn had impact on other lives. And what we saw last week was the way we treat people really, really matters. It influences people's lives in this world, and it influences people's eternity. And if I think we all kind of know that, right? That obviously it makes sense that if we treat people well, it's going to have an effect. I mean, we can think through that in our own lives, that if something is going on that you don't like, if you run up and start screaming at someone, they're probably not going to hear you. But in most cases, if you talk to people nicely and politely, people will generally do what you ask them to do. So it's kind of an obvious factor. And it's important that we do that. But I think that sometimes we kind of say, well, that's the goal. Well, as long as I'm nice to people, then I'm just doing all I need to do. And we might be tempted to stop there. But we've seen what the Apostle Paul did in this situation, but I'd like to look at what James says about the situation. Remember, James was the brother of Jesus. And James was kind of interesting because he didn't believe in Jesus before the cross, but he came to be a Jesus follower after the cross. So he was someone who doubted. Because let's be real, if your big brother told you he was Christ, would you believe him? Of course not. Of course not. And I think that was the challenge that James had to live with. But James became a tremendous leader in the church. And one of the things that I like about James is he speaks really plainly. And by speaking so plainly, you never have to guess what he means. In fact, you remember that in week 1, when we were talking about that big meeting coming together about these new Christians that we're developing and what they should have to do and how they should have to go through things and what rituals they should have to follow. Remember what James said? I don't think we should make it difficult for these people who are coming to God. And that kind of became the foundation of the church. So he makes things really clear, but there's another thing about James. Because he speaks so plainly, oftentimes his words are harsh because he just says what he thinks needs to be said. And so when it comes to this issue of it's important to talk to people nicely, to be nice, James tells us that's just the starting point. What James says is that if you claim to be religious but don't control your tongue, you're fooling yourself. And your religion is worthless. Now, that's a bit extreme, but that's James's words. And what he's basically saying there is that, yeah, treating people nice and being polite, it's important, but it's just the beginning. It's just the launching off point that you have to do that. If you're not at least doing that, if you're not at least being a polite and being a citizen that lives well, if you're not at least doing that, you're missing something. Because there's more that we should be doing. Because as he continues, he tells us what he thinks it really means to be a Jesus follower. He says that pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. So what he's saying is that what you do for people is what really matters. Helping those in need is what really matters. Now, as he says orphans and widows in their distress, it may sound like he's being super, super specific. But he means that as an example. Because in the time that he lived in, orphans and widows were the most needy people there were. Because in that time, in a male-centric society, with no backstop, no social support available, if a woman lost her husband, she was helpless. She would have no way to support herself. If a child did not have a father, there was no hope. They were destined for poverty. Both that woman or the child would live in the streets because they would lack something so important. They would lack the support for their family that was needed to survive. So James says that's what we need to be looking for, and that's what we need to be willing to step into. That's the good that we need to be willing to do. Of course, you treat people well, but then you step into the fire. You look for the challenges and the difficulties out there, and you step into them. Basically, James is telling us to go out there and look for the people in need and do what needs to be done. And I think the reason he points out the orphans and the widows is he said, we might be tempted to only help people who are far away. And although that's important, we need to be willing to help the people who are right where you're at. When I lived in New York City, you step over homeless people on your way to work. You literally do. I worked with multimillionaires who stepped over homeless people on their way to work. And in Jerusalem in the first century, there is no doubt the same sort of thing was happening. And what James is saying is that as Christians, as Jesus followers, we need to be different. That we need to start looking out for everyone, not just ourselves, and we need to look right where we've been located to see what we can do. And we're not just going to look out for Christians. We're going to look out for everyone. There is no condition on what you believe or what your background is in order to help. So on our topic that we're talking about, being a community church in the 21st century, what does my little story here, my little message mean for us? Well, I think it means that we need to continue to build on what we've done. We've been a community church for a very long time. But I think we need to expand our focus. And this is something I've talked to our missions team about, I've talked to our council about. Something we need to step in more directly. So over these past few weeks, I've had an opportunity to kind of go around and try to understand more the needs that we have right here. And so over these past few weeks, I've had a chance to go out to the school and talk to some of the folks who work at the school. I've had a chance to talk to the homeschooling organization. I've had a chance to talk to some of the administrative offices around town. And although in each environment, the specific stories or the specific things I hear are a little bit different. Sometimes what's being seen, sometimes what's being directly experienced. But although these little details are different, there's one thing that all of my conversations have in common. That families here where we live are struggling like they never have before. Now, I make no claim that parenting was ever easy. Parenting has always been hard. No two ways about that. But somehow, things are different now. Children, parents, families are struggling in ways that they never have before. I mean, children are struggling with loneliness, the inability to connect with anyone, the inability to have any sense that they feel connected to anyone. I mean, and parents are struggling with loneliness, isolation, this incredible difficulty finding support, that I just would like to talk to someone. You know, even if they don't know what I should do, if they just were going through it as well, if I could just talk to them about what they're experiencing, that would make a difference. My friends, the people and the families in our town, in our region, are living in distress. So we have to look again at what James says to us, that we are responsible to care for the orphans and widows who are in distress. So I think we need to take that message that James gives us, that we are responsible to care for them, to step into it, to do what we can do. And again, although James was using an example from his time, it applies so much to our time. Because again, what did the orphan and the widow represent? It represented those people who did not have the family support that they needed for wellness. I think we can all agree that family support makes a huge difference. If you grew up in a family that provided good support, good emotional support, a healthy environment, you know it really matters. If you grew up in a family that did not have emotional support and healthy wellness, you know it really matters. And my friends, today, many people are struggling. And so often we're tempted to only look at financial needs. And of course, finances matter. If you can't pay your bills, what are you going to do? But the problem is so much bigger than that. There's a mental health issue. There's a emotional health emotional health issue that is just, it's rampant in the time we live in. It's unbelievable. And these challenges are substantial. And they have to be dealt with. And I believe God calls us to be part of that solution. And one of the things that I think that those of us who are older can be very tempted to say is that when we see families say that they're struggling and they're having trouble, we might say, well, maybe if they just tried harder, it'd be easier. I don't think that's true. I don't think this is an issue tied to laziness. You know, I don't think that people aren't trying. I think that we have to recognize that we live in a time in human existence that has never existed before. We face challenges that families never, ever dealt with before. Because we have to remember that the current generation of kids is what's called Gen Z. Because we're kind of running out of letters, I guess. So we're up to Gen Z now, right? But Gen Z, generally speaking, is someone born in 1999 or later. What is the distinguishing factor of someone born 1999 or later? They've lived in a deeply connected world their entire lives. They know no time with no technology. They know no time without internet. And what that means is there are incredible benefits that come from the technology, but their psychology, their mental health is also impacted by that connectedness. In some studies, many members of that generation spend over 12 hours a day connected to technology. either on the internet or smartphones or video games or whatever. But also, because of the internet, information is more available than ever. Information about everything. But if there's information available, what else is available? Misinformation. It is statistically proven that an incorrect fact travels on the internet 5 times faster than a correct fact. So that means that 80% of what you find is wrong. That's the truth. And so you're 7 years old, and you get 20 minutes in front of the internet. Would your parents step away for a minute? What might you see? And to be clear here, I don't mean to vilify technology. My house was paid for by technology. I'm in with technology, right, sort of thing. But there is a responsibility factor of it, but there's also a repercussions factor to it. Because what we know is that so much of what is out there is manipulated. Images are manipulated to make things seem possible that are not. Images are manipulated to tell young women that they're supposed to look away, that they can't. Information is manipulated to make lies look like truth. And this is the environment that our children are growing up in, and this is the environment that parents are faced with dealing with. And so we have to do something. And I think we would all agree that these are hard problems. How do we help? I don't know, but I think we have to try. I think we have to try to figure it out. Because as Christians, running into that fire is our responsibility. It is our responsibility to say, this is a real challenge. We need to do what we can to help. Because as Christians, that's actually part of our legacy. To go in and provide whatever help you can, and be willing to do what you can, even if you don't know entirely what to do. In fact, it's interesting. The willingness to do the impossible, or to attempt to do the impossible, goes back to the very first moments of Christianity. Because when the 12 apostles, who have been traveling with Jesus for years, and Jesus for the first time says to them, okay, I'm going to send you guys out on your own for a little while. So I'm going to be here. I'm going to have you guys go out and talk to people. This was the directive they were given by Jesus. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Now, if we look at that list, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse leprosy. Leprosy was an unhealable illness at that time. What was Jesus doing? He says, I'm sending you to do the impossible. Because in my power, you can do the impossible. That if you'll be willing to step out, show up, and do what you can, you will start to see amazing outcomes beyond your own ability. Now, I'm quite certain that God helps us to do miraculous things. I have had experiences in my life that I am certain are miraculous. But here's what's really amazing, that if we look at the history of Christianity and the things that Christians have done over the centuries, oftentimes what's needed is not miraculous actions. Rather, what's most needed is to simply show up, be present, be compassionate, figure out what you can do, and do something. Simple actions of love and compassion can produce incredible outcomes. They can produce miraculous outcomes. There's a 20th century historian named William H. McNeill. Most of the books he wrote were in the 1960s and 1970s. And his specialty as a historian was looking at the forces that impact people. Why do people move to an area over centuries? How do cultures develop? And that was his specialty. And he's written a number of books around that. One of his books was Plagues and Peoples. And to be clear, he's not a Christian historian, he's a mainstream historian. And he talked about plagues and the impact of Christians. And the data shows that when a plague moved through a region, the survivability rate of the people in that area was tied to how many Christians lived in the area. An area that had Christians had much higher survivability rates, not just among the Christians, but among everyone. And they tie it back to something incredible: basic nursing care. Because the Christians would clean you up if you were sick. If you were too weak to feed yourself, the Christians would feed you. If you were too weak to get to water, the Christians would give you water. And not just the other Christians, but everyone. Those simple acts increased survival among plague victims. So what that means for us is that we have to be willing to do the same thing in our time, that we need to be willing to step out and do what we can. Because we live in a time of unprecedented challenges, that families are struggling like never before. Children are struggling like never before. And all of these problems existed before the pandemic. But now with the pandemic, it's all so much worse. I mean, loneliness, depression, and anxiety are at record levels. Addiction rates among children and their parents are at record levels. Suicide rates for 10, 11, 12-year-olds are higher than they've ever been in human history. We live in something that we need to be willing to step into, because I believe it's why we're here. And we need to be willing to do that. So as we go forward as a community church, we are going to start to orient around that idea more and more, because it's who we are. We serve our community. That's what's never changed. We just need to zero in on the problems that are in front of us right now. So again, we've just started the conversations over what we're going to do, but fundamentally, we're going to be looking for opportunities to offer programs that can support children, that can support parents. And we want to make this available to everyone in the area who wants to come. Because we want to remember, just as last week, we talked about the fact that our church is not this building. Our church is you. Right? Our church is the people and families who make up this church. Well, in the same way, our community is not a chunk of land with lines drawn around it on a map. It's not the buildings. It's the people and the families who live around us. Because what I think we need to do is that we need to focus in on using what God has freely given us to make a difference here, to lift up people, to lift up families, to support families, to serve these families. So what does that mean for all of us? Well, it means that we've got to be in this together. And as we look at going forward and we look at using our resources to make our location more accessible or appealing to people around us, we need to be willing to do that. As we try to identify programs that we can offer, because we're not qualified to necessarily create programs, but there are programs out there that just aren't being offered. We can start to offer those programs. We need to be on board with that. When the time comes to need volunteers to support these things, volunteer. None of those things are today. But this needs to be a major direction of where we're going. Because in every single conversation I had, it included issues like this. So let's continue that tradition of our own, of being a community church, but let's continue that tradition of being Christians. That whenever the Christians saw people facing challenges, they didn't run away. They ran towards them. They ran towards those who needed help. We need to run towards the people who need help. And just like those early Christians got to see the impossible happen, healing that didn't seem possible, that same option exists for us. So let's be willing to be part of doing the impossible.